It's an honor to be here and talk to you again. As I introduce myself, Reay with the Ministry of Forests and Lands, and I have the honor of working today with...
Again, Dan Bernier, a biologist with Halfway River First Nation. I've been working with Halfway as an environmental scientist and land planner for the better part of the last 8 years. And Gary and I have been working together on the Regional Strategic Environmental Assessment for probably about 4 years now. And hopefully we'll be able to conclude this mega project sometime in the next year or 18 months.
So we gave a presentation at your December 19th meeting, and there was a couple people in the room and maybe on the phone that actually saw that presentation. We've sort of augmented it and expanded a bit and want to go over it again, and because of the filming, that way we've got the whole thing as one presentation. So for those of you who saw what we talked about on December 19th, you'll see some repetition, and we apologize for that. Okay, so RSEA, Regional Strategic Environmental Assessment. We call it RSEA, so that's the acronym we use. You guys have your own whole world of acronyms, which I listened to yesterday, which I'm just gonna say, I would like to put the jar in the middle of the table for every time you use an acronym. If you guys would put a loonie in there, we'll have a lot of money, Dan and I, to finish our project. So anyways, we speak in acronyms, and so you'll get used to hearing RSEA. RSEA is one of the 4 projects underway across the north of British Columbia under the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, ESI. So there was a $30 million pot put together in 2014 by the provincial government, went into conversations with the 35 nations across the north. We signed 4 enabling agreements with about 30 or 32 of the nations to be involved in ESI projects. Another acronym, Environmental Stewardship Initiative, ESI. So there's one on the north coast in and around Rupert and Kitimat. There's one in Skeena. There's one in Smithers area. There's one in the Omineeka in Prince George, and then there's ours in the northeast called RSEA. So those are the 4 projects. We've got enabling agreements that have been signed off by provincial ministers and First Nation chiefs. Each of the 4 enabling agreements are a bit different, and they're all doing something that's important to that regional area. And that's what we're working on here today. I think our whole presentation at the end of the day, I hope, answers that kind of question, right? But we're going to get into a lot of detail here. We've got a lot of slides. We're going to talk about the modeling. You guys talked about a lot of stuff yesterday, and I guess what I want to say is I think we have the tool that allows what you're asking to be modeled.
Right. The RSEA project started about 5 years ago as a response to numerous pipelines that were being proposed in 2013, 2014. There was the CGL, the PRGT, the West Coast Connector, Enbridge had their Northern Gateway. PNG was planning on looping their pipeline. And so there was a lot of anxiety, I guess, especially in northern BC, is what that would mean, especially in the territories that I represent. There's already so much disturbance on the land base, and when we're talking about putting more pipelines, it's like, well, what is that going to mean for the disturbance on the rest of the land base that hasn't been disturbed yet, or is it going to continually be disturbed? So the funding program came out of, a lot of that came out of the anxiety related to the pipelines. It's evolved since then. Almost all of those pipelines I just referenced received their environmental assessment certificate, and of course the CGL is moving forward right now. So it has evolved to keep up with the times the last 5 years, and what are the implications of the proposals that are actually going to take place, as opposed to what we were so worried about 5 years ago. If all of those pipelines had come through within, or had been started immediately, that was terrifying to a lot of the community members, and not just in Halfway, but all of the Treaty 8 nations, is what is that going to mean? So So we embarked on, that was sort of the background of why we embarked on this really large, ambitious environmental assessment, so we can understand what is the baseline, what are we looking at right now, how are things going to look in the future, and what can we do to ease everyone's anxiety and maintain the values that we have on the land base.
So, the slide kind of describes what Dan is saying about, a description of the current condition of the values that are important. And we've got a whole list of values that you can see that we're going to be talking about. But what we're trying to do at the end of the day is the optimization of the meaningful exercise.
Unknown participant is now joining.
The meaningful exercise of Treaty 8 rights with the development interests of the parties. So we want to optimize that for what we're doing. So, RSEA in the nutshell. Any questions?
Do you want me to talk about this? Okay. So when we first started RSEA, it was quite a process of trying to understand or come to a recognition of all the different values on the land base, considering all the different nations in the room and the different provincial agencies in the room. And we have 5 or 6 sort of main core values that we're working on, but there's dozens more underneath that the different nations have put forward as important. The most important ones are somewhat listed there. The ecosystems in general, having resilient ecosystems is a value. And I'll talk about each of these really briefly in the following slides. Environmental livelihoods was really critical, talking about food security and the ability to be on the land base, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. The Moose Working Group, Moose obviously a super critical value in Northeast BC. Water Working Group, and given the stresses on the water as a resource, both its quantity and the quality, it's a really important value for us to study. Old Forest Working Group, it's not just the LNG industry that's disturbing our land bases. Forestry has been very active in Northeast BC for a lot of years, and the ability to maintain old forests, and it's directly related to our functional ecosystems as well, but it's a really important value to have those old growth forests for so many different reasons. The Peaceful Enjoyment Working Group, once again, this is talking about, well, I'll talk about it in a second, I've got other slides. And Data Management Working Group, the importance of having solid data that we can have as a baseline for now and going into the future. That became a working group as well. And from all that, there's on the other side, the methods pilot. We're really lucky at Halfway River. We have an excellent database already, and not every nation has that 25-year database of all our TUS data and TK data. So Halfway proposed at one point along this line saying, all the other nations are collecting some of this data. We want to just make sure that this RSEA is going to work. We want to test the methods out and see, okay, using Halfway and Halfway's critical areas as a test case to see if we can do this over 20 million hectares, which is the RSEA area. I think it's almost a fifth of BC or a sixth of BC is the whole RSEA. So the methods pilot was originally proposed by Halfway. Blueberry River First Nation joined us almost immediately as well, because they felt the Fort St. John Timber Supply area, both Blueberry and Halfway, it's their critical territory. So, and we'll talk more about the methods pilot.
Right, so now we have a series of slides. We're going to go through each of these values, and then we'll go through the modeling that we have underway in what's referred in the pilot area itself. So that's kind of the progression of our
So we won't go into a ton of detail on every single one of these, but the objective, what we're trying to get across here is this is a really comprehensive project, and there is a ton of information, a ton of brain power has been put into this over the last few years. And when you put 7 nations in the room, along with numerous government agencies, it's sometimes difficult to get to understand what perspective we're coming from. So you'll see in some of these slides, some nations are focusing on certain values more than other values. It doesn't mean it's less important necessarily to the other nations. It's just really important to particular nations. For example, environmental livelihoods. We have Soto First Nation, McLeod Indian Band, and West Moberly First Nation. So their critical territory is generally south of the Peace and heading into the foothills. And they spent several years on a specific project looking at environmental livelihoods and the amount of moose available on the land base, how much moose is being harvested, how much needs to be harvested, do you have the ability to harvest moose and other species as well on the land base. And they had hired some folks out of Saskatchewan.
University of Saskatchewan.
To help lead this. There was a lot of community consultations, surveys, got some incredible data out of there. I'm not going to speak to it because that's really their project, but it was a really important process to understand what, how much moose is out there, frankly, and these are all tied in together, you'll see, but this was really critical, and this area was that we focused on was south of the Peace for them.
But the Peaceful Enjoyment Working Group, this gets into the start of a treaty right, peaceful enjoyment, the peace in the land. And so what we've done is we used, the province had a recreational opportunity spectrum that talked about roadedness, right? From urban to wilderness, and there's a whole bunch of categories and classes in that. So we've updated that layer to today, and basically it gives you areas where you can understand and potentially practice your treaty rights. And what's the condition of the land while you're out there? Are you going to see people coming by, or are you going to see people walking by? So roadedness gives you an idea about the level of peaceful enjoyment that you would have. And we've got an updated map.
So just to point this out, this is pretty much the entire northeast there. Dawson Creek Timber Supply Area, Fort St. John Timber Supply Area, and Fort Nelson Timber Supply Area. This is the core area for blueberry and halfway. And the green, blue color, those are the areas that are still somewhat pristine-ish, wilderness classification. Anything in towards these red and yellows is very heavily eroded areas. So just at a glance, you can see why there's already some concern. This is today's erodedness map. So there's obvious reason. Like blueberry is right about here, halfway is right about here, our communities. The vast majority of the hunting and whatnot takes place in this part of the territory. So as we are building out, you can see that everyone is getting pushed further and further away to try and practice peaceful enjoyment. Motley Clay.
We have a really good map.
We do have a map. It's
We have a
not,
map.
but it's essentially this area here, and it does come into Alberta, up and through here.
That's where all the gas comes from.
We have a map that shows exactly where it is. Maybe we're out of order. Ecosystem.
So resilient ecosystems is a really important value for the land base for many different reasons. We have different indicators that tell us whether or not the condition of those ecosystems, the function of those ecosystems, the structure of those ecosystems. And we undertook a large scale ecosystem mapping project because there wasn't a decent ecosystem mapping project available for us. So this was a really innovative project. It's done for the entire Fort St. John Timber Supply Area, and it gets right down, I believe they're 25 meter by 25 meter pixels, using the most modern technology to understand essentially what's the flow of moisture. Moisture availability is generally what drives what kind of ecosystems we have on the land base. And that's why you end up with products that look like this and show us where the wetter areas are, the drier areas are, the poor nutrient or the rich nutrients. So this product is available for the entire timber supply area.
So it's a baseline layer of information that we have.
We renamed this a biodiversity working group. It used to be the old growth working group. I don't know what area that is, Gary, but this working group has been focused on the concept that we need to maintain a certain percentage of old growth forest on the land base in order to have functional ecosystems. And we have, this is not just old growth patches here and there. We are looking at the connectivity of those patches and the landscape context of those patches, making sure that we don't just have, we may have, let's say, 30,000 hectares of old growth forest, but if it's in 30,000 1 hectare patches, that's not functioning as old growth. So we are looking at the context of the old growth at the same time.
And that's Fort St. John in the north and Dawson Creek in the south, with the piece kind of going right through here. So
I believe, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what this one is here, but I believe this is, anything in red hasn't met the baseline for enough old growth forest.
yeah.
Okay. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. The water working group, again, there's some really innovative modeling that took place both for water quantity and water quality in the different watersheds, and looking at water availability now and down the road. Fracking obviously uses a tremendous amount of water, and that's the preferred tool these days for all of the for the money play. So it's critical that we have a handle on how much water is available and the quality of that water.
Just a question, in the old growth forestry, did they use language like culturally modified trees in the old growth forest area?
We use, in the traditional use component of it, old growth was focused more on the environmental value of having, okay, if you have 140 plus year old trees, what habitat is that providing for the animals and for the ecosystems? There's a full traditional use and traditional ecological knowledge section as well, where we can talk a little bit about that. Moose. So again, very critical for the exercise of treaty rights to be able to harvest moose. Moose is the preferred animal of choice in the Northeast BC, and there's a lot of work put into modeling the capability and suitability of the habitat across the north. Where are the critical areas for moose, for calving and for under the winter range, etc. And it's looking at the connectivity across the land base and making sure that we're not creating genetic islands anywhere by cutting off the ability of moose to travel down traditional corridors. And to just essentially see how much habitat we have out there, and is that enough habitat in the right condition, in the right structure, in the right function in order to maintain a healthy supply of moose. Okay, so the traditional use, this is interesting for a lot of ways. Land planning in BC historically hasn't included a lot of First Nation values as a core value when planning on the land. So this process here, together with the new LRMP that is starting in Fort St. John, is one of the first is really embedding the First Nation values in the as something that has to be maintained on the land base. Okay. Again, so every nation has different values, but generally all the nations are supporting each other on what's the most important piece, and are trying to work together to identify the values on the land base and how to maintain those values. So again, Soto, Westmo, and McLeod Lake focusing more on environmental livelihood component as a value. Doig First Nation, which is just north of us, is about, which is north of Blueberry. It's about an hour north of Fort St. John, give or take. They're spending a lot of time documenting their traditional use, knowledge. They haven't had the opportunities the way some of the other nations have. Everyone's in a sort of different state, so they're spending a lot of time documenting historical corridors and some of the songs is an important part of what they're documenting as well. Prophet River, and I'm just commenting because these are the 7 nations a part of it. Prophet River is a little bit late to deciding how they wanted to participate in RSEA, but they proposed some new projects as well. Their territory comes just down into the Fort St. John TSA. Most of it is up in Fort Nelson area, but they have proposed some new studies that they haven't started yet, hopefully this year. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but Blueberry River and Halfway River, we've spent a lot of our time using the data that we have to identify critical areas on the land base, mapping them both spatially and temporally on the land base into what we call our management zones. These are our key priority management areas, and I'll talk to that at the end of this slide.
So Dan's talked a lot about the different data layers, but now you need, as he said at the beginning, you need to do something with that data. So we started a methods pilot. It's on the Fort St. John timber supply area, so about 4 million hectares in size. Like it says up here, it's a proof of concept. It's a project to try and say, now that we've got all that data, what do you do with it? So this is the Williston right here. The Fort St. John timber supply area is this blue area here. And the Montney play, where the Montney shale play, is that the technical name? Where natural gas comes from, is this purple area right here, and it goes into Alberta, right? So any gas, well, I shouldn't say any gas. I guess there's still, is there gas coming out from Fort, do you guys know? Must be gas coming from Fort Nelson area, from the Liard. But the majority of the gas right now is coming out of the Montney area, and those are where the pipelines would start to go over to Kitimat or Prince Rupert or then up into the Nass, whatever proposal you have. It comes out of this area here. Okay? So as I said, you know, we're going to try and spatially show you how the optimization of the meaningful exercise of the Treaty 8 rights with the development interests of the party. So how do you bring that together? We've got a model. I guess the first thing I would say, you'll see that one of the partners that we've hired is Ecora, a consulting firm out of Kelowna. And they have partnered with the RSEA table, and in particular, the leadership from Halfway River, Blueberry River, and the province working together as a steering committee to drive the methods pilot. And so that's why you have Ecora here. They're one of our partners. What are we trying to do? We're trying to look at what the current state looks like. We apply a bunch of assumptions to it so we can figure out what the future state is. We're basically using like 100 years. So you can project everything that we're talking about over the next 100 years. Here's what it looks like now. What is it going to look like in the future? That's the idea of what we're trying to get to. So we're trying to project two major activities, petroleum, natural gas, and forestry. And within the natural gas, we're going to project well pads, those little things, as well as the pipeline right-of-ways that connect up each of the well pads. Okay, so we can project that into the future for natural gas. And for forestry, we can project roads and the cut blocks associated with each of the roads. So, you know, think about what Dan said earlier about old growth forests. We got forests, and we can project where roads and cut blocks are going to go over the next 100 years. So our modeling framework is you have the current state, you have the future LNG footprint, you have the future forestry footprint, and then you combine them. So in that, we have pipeline right-of-ways, we have roads, we combine them, and you can go forward. So this is an overview of our modeling framework.
I just want to comment that we've been doing this in forestry for many years, trying to project the future, trying to project where those disturbances are going to take place. We've been, for whatever reason, we haven't really done this in the PNG industry. So this is quite an innovative project. It took several years. CAP was involved, of course, and you know, the OGC, and trying to come up with a way of projecting surface disturbance for an industry that's relying on gas 2 kilometers below the surface. So it is quite a process that we have to go through, but I believe everybody is pretty confident that this is a logical way that the oil and gas industry will build itself out over the next 50 years. And there's a lot of controversy around this too, as you can imagine. the oil and gas industry, very historically keeps a lot of things close to their chest. I mean, you're in this room, of course. So seeing some of those played out, and you start thinking, okay, this is going to be on, in our tenure. But we're working together because from halfway perspective, well, this is our territory. So we have to work together to see how our surface is going to get disturbed. We have to do this together. We have to share information, not keep our cards too close to our chest. And that works in both directions.
So now we get into the values, and this builds upon what Dan was talking about earlier. If you can see across the top, you can see the valued components that we talked about. Now you can see about the values that we're using to help explain each of those valued components. Then we have a whole series of indicators for each of the values. And we're not going to bore you, and we're not going to go through, but we have like 100 indicators to look at these
28.
Of these 28 values. And you can see as we project the future state, how each of these values either stays the same, gets worse, and or maybe even gets better. But you have a current state, and you know what it looks like in the future of all these different values.
So when it comes to, on the previous one, wildlife, we do tend to talk about moose a lot, but we're also looking at grizzly and caribou. When we talk about ecosystems, you can see, just as examples, the types of indicators we're looking at. Ecosystem representation is an important one, not just old forests or those other ones there, but understanding where the ecosystems are on the land base, the importance of every ecosystem in order to be able to function as a land base. So we're looking at what ecosystems are protected and where, and is that enough in order to maintain the values of those ecosystems. And not to jump to the conclusions or anything, but there are a lot of the uncommon ecosystems that they're not protected at all. There's very little provincial parks or federal parks in the areas. There's not a lot of protection of these sites. And so when you have numerous unusual ecosystems, I know most people don't think of the boreal forest having a lot of uncommon ecosystems, but they really do in this transition area between the foothills and the boreal forest. There's some really cool ecosystems there. And so it's really important to understand the protection levels of those ecosystems, and as we're planning out development of industries.
So maybe I'll say for all you modeling geeks who want to understand how we did this, it's like this is a different way of saying our existing state and how we get to our future state. In the world of forestry, we use a model called Patchworks, and this has been done, as Dan said, all over the province this way. What's unique and new about this is we've actually got a PNG model. And we use two different model types. Along with the forestry model, we bring it together into a future state. You can assess it using indicators from the last slide. And you can have different scenarios and define different scenarios to see how you're dealing with your current state and how you're improving your future state. So it's basically a continuous model. This is the graphic of just explaining what we're trying to do.
This is the crux of the entire project right here. It's knowing that this is the state of our land base right now. If we keep moving forward, just status quo with the PNG, with forestry, this is what our land base is going to look like in 5 years, in 25 years, in 50 years. And if that's not acceptable, in a lot of cases, most cases, it's really not, we're not able to maintain the values on the land base. So we have to look at alternative scenarios, and this is what Gary's talking about, the looping mechanism. Okay, well, what if we restore our land at a much more aggressive pace than we are right now? What if the PNG industry decides they want to accelerate their extraction of the resource? So instead of pulling all the gas out of the Montney Play over the next 100 years, we want to get it out in the next 40 years. Well, what does that mean temporally and spatially for extracting that gas? And what will that do to the values on the land base if we extract it in 40 years instead of 100 years? So that's the heart of this project, is just having the ability with these models to put forward a different scenario Okay, one of the scenarios is, well, what if all the First Nations we have our values mapped on the land base? What if we protected all of those? Okay, every single one of them has 100% protection, or 20% of them have 100% protection, and are moderate, or other areas, well, we can allow a little bit of disturbance. What does that look like from an economic perspective if we take a First Nations view of the land base instead of a maximum extraction view of the land base?
In the world of forestry, so we just want to, for the people that understand forestry, the model that we're using Patchworks. It's benchmarked against a timber supply review process. So the chief forester has a timber supply review process. And so what we've done is updated from the last timber supply review we've produced a base case to August of 2019. So we've updated all the model, all the information. We've put it into a data package so that we've written down all the assumptions that we've used. And that way anybody can critique it, look at it, and understand what we've done.
And like Reay was saying earlier, these are done across the entire province for every single timber supply area. And these data packages are very standard, and people are pretty used to reading them now. So that's why at RSEA we did the exact same thing that the province would have done for all the other areas, but we've done it for our own purposes and updated it again to make sure that we're using the most current information.
So maybe the unique aspect of what we've done, and we've said this a few times, is we've done exactly the same thing now in the oil and gas modeling world. We've actually developed a model. And in the forestry world, you're able to do it using one model. We have to use 3 models to look at the gas extraction, because as you know, it's underground and above ground. And so you've got to have multiple layers, multiple models to be able to do that. So the first part of our 3-step process is to predict the pattern of subsurface development. And so we have a PNG model. The PNG model, step 1, is based on all the PNG tenures that are out there. We've tenured, and I believe we've probably tenured about 90-something% of the Montney play. So you start with what's tenured as your first assumption within that. There's a lot of areas that we deem to be untenured, such as ecological reserves and parks that are inside those that have kind of a no surface disturbance kind of aspect to them. And so those are untenured, but you start with the tenured areas. Then you've got to have a production. How much gas are you trying to get out of the ground? And I know, Alex, you were using a term yesterday. We talk in billion cubic feet per day. And so we're going to have to convert whatever you guys were talking about yesterday to this, or we need to convert this to whatever you're talking about so that we can actually look at the FNCI scenario. But this is our base case scenario. And our base case scenario has us producing 5.3 billion cubic feet per day today. And that's how much gas is produced in the Northeast that supplies the domestic North American market. So we factored into our model LNG Canada. And what we did was we increase it in 5 years to 7.3 billion, and we increase it 5 more years later, or 10 years from now, to 9.3 billion. So we have in our base case assumption is LNG Canada fully built out. Okay, so, and then what this shows, the Montney play, the portion of the Montney in Fort St. John, you can see this is the results. The model, as Dan said, has us going out about 100 years, or actually I think it's 84 years, and it drops off. So based on current technology, based on current assumptions, that's 84 or 86 years of gas in the Montney play coming out. Now, One of the things that we have not done in the world of the PNG modeling is change any of the assumptions for increased technology. There's a lot of people in this room that understand this way better than I do. What you were doing 10 or 15 years ago is not what you're doing today. What you're doing 10 or 15 or 20 years from now might be the same as today or might not be. We're just telling you, based on today's assumptions, this is how we've modeled it.
We're testing that model against what does it do to the values on the land base. The spatial pattern is not really going to change if we accelerate or increase our production. We could double it. The same spatial pattern would generally be the same. It's just now it's taking place a lot faster. Now, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't give the land enough time potentially to recover if we don't plan for an accelerated restoration program at the same time. Okay? So that's what all those other
Unknown
indicators.
participant is now joining.
That's what all those other indicators are actually trying to just give us an idea. If we change our management regime, if we protect some areas, if we do a project that really accelerates it, what is that actually going to do to the land base, and can we maintain the values that we've identified over time for the next 7 generations? That's really what we're trying to get to the heart of here. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess
It's now
a
exiting.
question around assumptions of market, right? We know that's changing, and markets to the U.S. and distribution are changing. Did you keep that static? Because again, it's not shifting demand, and gas might be moving more west rather than east and south. Who knows, right? So did you factor that?
At this point, no. It's a
Okay.
static, like this
Just
5.3 is the north, like you can, if you put this across here, that's what we're, 5.3 plus LNG Canada is basically what we're modeling.
One of the assumptions we had was there's a certain amount of infrastructure the PNG industry wants to fill. Right? So we recognize there are going to be market shifts, but we're still going to want to fill that infrastructure, whether it's going to the States or going overseas. It didn't really change the modeling exercise for us.
Okay, and here's the real unique stuff, and this is what starts with the PNG model. I just going to get through some real technical aspects to understand this. Starts with the tenured area, but then you have a well pad. That's what that is signifying. This is how the model works. That's a well pad. That is 6 hectares in size. A well pad that is cleared. Then there's assumptions going down about how different wells, how many wells per a well pad are put onto that well pad. We have a slide that explains to you what the numbers are.
In order to drain the entire
Right.
drainage area.
So from that well pad, you can go 1,600 meters out and 5,000 meters or 2,500 meters either way for 5,000 meters, so that you can create a drainage area of 800 hectares. One 6-hectare well pad drains 800 hectares of gas from below the ground. And that's a basic assumption. Now,
Today's technology,
Today's-
directional drilling will allow us to do this. We know that there's numerous companies that are already going further than that. We work with almost every company, and I know that there are companies going a lot further than 2.5 kilometers north and south. Okay, because of the alignment of the formation underneath the Montney, it kind of goes in this direction. Okay, so when you're fracking, you can go a lot further north south than east west. Okay? So that's why it's not just a square. It's just you're constrained by the formation of the Montney Clay on the east west direction.
so as we said, this is an assumption. So we potentially could do some sensitivity analysis if somebody else wants to give us some other numbers that can go in here. But you got to have a base to start with. Because we have each of the sub areas that are within the tenured area, the whole tenure area of Montney. This here, we have 9 sub areas, and it tells you how many wells per pad go in each of the sub areas. This is the base case assumption. There's the number there. And then you can see the different sub areas. This, from the experts, is the production that comes off a well. starting in time 0 and going for 45 years. So it's just depending on where you are, that graph is applied with those number of wells in the model. Okay, step 2, you got to place now the well pads that I just explained on the surface. And you've got to have the pipelines that need to connect them up. Because remember, we're talking about today, but for the next 100 years. So we use a model called AI tree. And it takes well pads and places well pads on the land in a projection, and then it has the right-of-ways signifying the pipelines to hook up the well pads. You'll note in the model that this is an exclusion zone, so well pads are not able to be placed in this exclusion zone or across the exclusion zone. So again, we're trying to mimic management on the land the best we can.
I'm trying to bring it back, but these are existing exclusion zones based from OGA, the Oil and Gas Activities Act. You have a certain amount of distance around rivers and creeks and such that you have to manage differently. A lot of what we're talking about as RSEA is, well, is that good enough? And so our baseline is, this is status quo. But like I'm just noticing here, this is the Cameron River, which is a really critical corridor for Halfway River and hunting grounds for the community and just use of this area. Our exclusion zone is a lot bigger, right? So I just want to keep introducing that concept. This is the baseline. What the community and what our mapping has shown is that exclusion zone isn't sufficient. Okay, that it has to be, it's substantially wider. It's actually more like 4 or 5 kilometers apart. Now, this model as well, I just want to comment, you may want to say it too, but is working under the assumption we're trying to get every last drop of gas out of the ground, every last little bit we can. And so what this model is trying to get a pad into every single drainage area across the entire Montney.
So then maybe I can just add, so the question that we posed yesterday in the FNCI survey is what are the implications of this amount of gas for the Treaty 8 First Nations, for their territories? That's going to be extracted according to that, simulated by that model. And the FNCI Nation are concerned about the implications of that development.
So we keep getting into the conversations about the future scenarios. We're just trying to explain to you current management, right? Because you can talk all you want about the future scenarios, but we've got the current is the idea here.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Just on your comment about the drilling and getting the maximum amount of well sites. Did you guys put a layer around the cost of gas, like the commodity price and the cost to drill? Because
No.
okay, because you're not going to.
No.
Yeah.
I think that's the difference between a projection of something that goes over 80, 84, 86 years and what you do on a year-by-year basis. So this is a model. It's a projected model. How do you improve a projected model? Well, you get some real-life information from the proponents of forestry and or natural gas to actually drive the model. So, and that would be improvements is getting everyone to talk about what you're going to do the next 20 years. And then we would have the model what you're actually going to do. But right now, we have, it starts with a projection, right? So it's a idea, a potential, right?
Price doesn't matter. It's based on full well.
Yeah, to an extent, Patchworks, and we really need Krista here to explain this. I'm not a modeler, but Patchworks has the ability to add the cost into your scenario. Okay, so it's used in forestry all the time to say, okay, well, this stand is 150 kilometers from the mill. It has a lower value than 20 kilometers.
That makes sense.
And so as it builds out, and then there's certain rules in forestry, you have to take, especially in forestry, John, you have to take a certain amount of wood, a certain distance from the mill. So you build those rules into patchworks. And once we put the oil and gas and the forestry together in patchworks, you have the ability to start doing that. We haven't yet, but you do have the ability to add economic viability of some kind into it.
All great suggestions. And again, as we started, this has never been done.
No, exactly.
Right? So, great way, bring their money, and we'll continue to improve our model. Okay, so here's how the methods pilot base case works right now. You have all your data layers and management assumptions that we start with. Can we change them? By all means. But we've got a whole bunch of them laid out in the two data packages. You basically define all the values, and we showed you what values that we're using and the indicators of that. You run models, which projects future disturbance. And then you combine and look at what the indicators are for the base case, right? We're not talking about, but we can talk about, oh well. You can, and then what we've done is we're going into each indicator from the base case. What does the indicator look like? Is it good, bad, or ugly? A lot of them are not on the good side. So we need to do something with scenarios that changes the way an indicator and or a value looks like. And that's going from, so we can get management recommendations at the end of the day. So basically, you start with the current state. This is the modeling framework that gives us a future state that's different than the current assumptions that we're doing right now. Our expectations is the management on the land, based on our better understanding of what the condition of values are in, is going to change. And we have to, that's what we're trying to test here. Now, we've got a whole pile of results that on the base case. So that next time we have to figure out a way in running our model, because we have to hook into it now. We want to be able to show you certain areas about what it looks like, because we can project. You can go into, Dan mentioned the Cameron Valley. You can go in there and select that area and say, currently here's what it looks like, and run the model, and you can see where forestry and natural gas is going, and it shows you over the next 100 years what it looks like. And it's really cool, and yes, you can go into, tell me an area, and we can look at it, and we can tell you what the model is predicting. But it might be, you know, the model might be saying that we're not extracting gas until year 50 from there. you're going to tell me, well, our plans is to go in there in 10 years. Okay, well, that's how we have to improve the model. But one thing that we found is this. Future production, the well pads produce presently about 40,000 hectares of disturbed land base. The future production, regardless of what the level is at, adds about 12,000 hectares, thereabouts. Don't quote me on the number, of new disturbance from the well pads. And as Dan said earlier, we've got a base case projection of going at 9.3 billion cubic feet per day. So if that number jumped to 18 billion cubic feet per day in 20 years from now, the new disturbance is still 12,000 hectares. It's just the fact that the gas that was going to be there for 84 years is only going to be there for 58 or 60. We've actually done, we've run some stuff at 15, I think. And I think the gas is there for 64 years, from 86 down to 64. So, you know, give us a number. We'll tell you what it looks like, and we'll tell you how it affects all the values that we had in this project.
Can I just provide a little commentary on what you just said there, Gary? So Gary just said there's 40,000 hectares of disturbed area right now.
That's well pad.
From well pads. Okay. And if we build out the entire Montney play, that's another 10,000, 12,000 hectares of well pads and disturbance. How is that possible? That's only 20% more. It just gives you an idea of how much disturbance is already on the land base, how much infrastructure has already been put in to the Montney play in the last 20 years. Okay, that's one of the graphs or maps that we showed earlier was the ROS, the Recreation Opportunity Spectrum map showing for peaceful enjoyment. You could just see that huge area around Fort St. John and the bulk of the Montney play where Halfway and Blueberry are. It's already built out like crazy. Okay, that was a huge surprise for us, by the way. We had no idea that it would. We're already 80% of the infrastructure essentially is already there. Okay, without a real solid plan on how we're going to restore the land base. It's why the communities and the elders are so concerned with the state of the land. They feel like they're turning over the land to the next generation in a way worse condition because it happened so fast. There was so much so fast. Which leads, of course, to a lot of what you're talking about is how do the nations feel up there about continued extraction, and how do we get the land base to heal faster? It's already 80% built up. I think that was a shock to all of us that are in the room, the RSEA room, going, wow, what was expecting that? So,
in your model, do you talk about, because obviously these wells are, some of them are very mature, including reclamation?
No, in the base case, but we're developing a scenario that would include some reclamation. Because I'm also going to say, we also know there's 300,000 kilometers of linear disturbance out there. And some of that linear disturbance is 40 years old. And it's been there for a while. We need to start to restore some of that stuff. So what can we can project for you, your FNCI, a number, but then we're also going to say, if it comes with some funds to deal with restoration, we can put in restoration goals, activities into the model to see, because we want, what did Dave call it yesterday? A net, how does Dave say that, Alex? Net zero, right? So, we're getting into a little technicalities here. Our methods pilot is for the north of the Peace River portion of the Montney play, which is about, I think it's 60%. Don't quote me on the number. So 40,000 hectares plus 12,000 hectares north of the Peace in the Montney. There's still pieces of the Montney south of the Peace that we would have to add those numbers to, but they're all relatively. It wouldn't be a massive increase number. It would be similar to the stuff that we found north of the Peace.
It just seems to me that when I hear from other people in the room saying they want to talk about healing of the land, that when you fly over that area and you see all the old seismic lines, in reality that stuff can be restored relatively quickly.
absolutely.
And as wells dry up and you reclaim the well pad area, then that becomes, because the way I hear you saying is it all sounds additive and that nothing is ever being subtracted. I don't think that's the case.
Well, in the forestry model, it absolutely is, right? So there is a model built in, okay, when we hit free to grow, when, so we include that in there. And we do have a process for PNG to have that as well. We're working through it, like for example, the seismic. Not all seismic lines were created equally. Right? Some were created 40 years ago that are still, they haven't recovered at all. Some of the new 3D seismic lines, the source lines and receiver lines, some of those are recovering fairly quickly. If it's in an upland, it tends to recover fairly quickly. If it's in a lowland or wetland, the recovery is much slower, especially wherever there's deep organics. Okay? So we are just starting to include those concepts of restoration into the PNG model.
As a scenario. So that becomes our scenario because, like Dan said, forestry, we cut the trees, we plant it, and so we basically stop the model for 7 or 10 years and then you start growing trees. We have to get to that same state in the world of PNG.
So can I just confirm that the information you were talking about, 20,000 or 12,000 hectares, that's within the Fort St. John timber supply area? not the entire month.
That's within the Fort St. That's my understanding, Alex. That because the methods pilot is in Fort St. John, which is the top 60% of the Montney play.
Right. And there would be other footprint outside of that.
Yeah.
And if I understand the well pads are predicted to be basically 5 kilometers apart, right? They're in the middle of the drainage area.
Yes.
They're 5 kilometers apart, and they're connected by pipelines in right of ways where there's a road.
Yes.
So that means that there's 12,000 hectares, and each one's 6 hectares, there's 2,000 well pads. If they're 5 kilometers apart, there's 10,000 kilometers of road and pipeline.
You've been doing some quick math, have you?
Well, I'm just, in
Yeah.
terms of the scale of implications, 10,000 or 12,000 hectares doesn't sound like very much. But when you put it in context of 10,000 kilometers of road, when you've got 300,000 kilometers of linear disturbance already on the landscape, the reason that Halfway and Blueberry First Nations are concerned about the development becomes a bit more obvious.
Yeah, because the existing development footprint, I mean, we want to improve the future, but the existing development footprint is pretty large in certain areas. Or maybe in all areas, I don't know, Dan.
The model uses existing disturbance, right? So if there's an existing road, it will follow that road. Even if there's never been a well or pad placed there, if there's a road from forestry or agriculture or anything else, it follows that road. Okay, so that's possibly why some of the numbers don't completely line up, but it's already disturbed, right? So we can have 20 more well pads down this road with very minimal disturbance to get there. Because there's already an 8-kilometer road with 2 pads on it.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Dan said, I think this was probably even if we had all the results, the interesting result to us was what the future footprint, because we all thought it was going to be much higher.
Agriculture included in your model at all? I don't know. So the piece area is pretty heavily agricultural.
Agriculture disturbance as part of the base case, but we only project forestry and natural gas.
So the base of agricultural disturbance that's already there
Is accounted for, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective, and I've already given a lot of this perspective away through the last hour, but why did Halfway participate in RSEA? Is a question I get quite frequently. And, essentially, leadership is really concerned about better relationships at Halfway. I'm only speaking for Halfway here, I'm not speaking for the other nations. We want to have better relationships with industry and with the province, and I think we're working towards that, improved relations over the last few years, and RSEA has been a big part of that for us, because it gets us at the table with the other nations and with the province, and with some industry reps, and starting to get an understanding of each other's perspectives and our purviews. What did I say? Oh, our data set. Our data set is everything to us. We really want to and take any opportunity possible to improve our data set. Okay, we had the vision of our lands manager, Rosalind, that set up 25 years ago, who started assembling all the TUS data and TEK data from every project that's ever been done, every project that's been done since, into probably the most comprehensive GIS database I think that any First Nation has in the province. And I do work with many nations, and this is an incredible resource. So Halfway participates in these projects as well, just because, a little bit greedy, for sure. We want to improve our data set as well, okay, and make sure that we have the best available data, and we can have these conversations with industry and with the province, knowing that we have the best data out there. And I've already mentioned this, but ensuring that the values that the community's gone through many years of identifying the values on the land base. What are the most important values? And how do we get those values to become a foundation for land use planning in the future? Okay, how do we get things like protection of spiritual sites, protection of wildlife corridors? Not necessarily protecting as in a national park, protecting the values within those wildlife corridors, you know, we could disturb them up to 10 or 20% per decade and allow them to, if there's an aggressive restoration program, then you could disturb another 10% the next decade and still maintain that corridor. But having those values incorporated into land planning processes are critical for halfway. And of course, yes, we're of the belief that we have gone a little too far. Some people say a lot too far in the Montney play of just going out and developing the area without enough concentration on how to restore the land base. Halfway's not opposed to development. They just want to see development take place, sure, a little more sustainably, and we want to be able to run some of our ideas through a land management model, okay, and see how that affects it. So that when we talk about an accelerated natural gas scenario, we can also talk about an accelerated restoration scenario, and you know, and those do become additive. Saying, okay, well, we're going accelerated here. Well, in order to maintain the values above certain thresholds, then we have to accelerate our restoration. We need some big time investment in cleaning up the land. Otherwise, the values that are so important to the community that have been identified are going to get lost and possibly permanent. And that's a big concern for the community. Making sure, again, that the land base, we want to improve the land base for the next generation. We don't talk about net zero, we talk about a net gain at this point, because right now the land base is in a lot of trouble. The baseline indicators show almost every indicator for almost every value is well below the threshold that is used scientifically, stated thresholds. Like we have some areas where we have 1% old growth left in a watershed, and everybody knows that that's not nearly enough in order to maintain functioning ecosystems and maintain the values that are protected in Treaty 8, frankly, the ability to hunt and use the land base. If there's no old growth, there's no moose around, we know the results. So,
if I could add to what Dan's talking about restoration here, you know, there's a policy about the dormant site regulation or something, right? So it's starting to do something to recover dormant sites. But as we said, there's a lot more disturbance and other stuff that's out there that a huge $1 billion, I'll throw it out there, restoration fund in the Northeast to work on restoration would be very helpful for the Treaty 8 nations and for our continued work that what we're doing out there. I think you've got some good examples here, Dan.
yeah, I've kind of commented on all of these already, especially that bottom one. This is something that we think is going to help us accelerate our restoration efforts in priority areas. I'm actually going to go to the next one. Okay. I want to talk, just my last slide is just talking about our management zones. So we've spent a lot of time at Halfway mapping the entire land base into 4 different priority areas, if you will. Okay. So we have preservation zones, high conservation zones, moderate conservation zones, and general use zones. Preservation zones are really, those are out of the, I want to stress this as well. These are all, the mapping starts with the TOS and TK database, and then adds the environmental information, adds any information we can related to policy or regulation on top of that, and we map out the whole land base. A preservation zone, that might be, I would say, under 10% of the land base, but those are our spiritual zones and critical cultural areas around the community, critical corridors for traditional hunting grounds, etc. That's our preservation zones, and the community doesn't want to see any more disturbance in those areas, and hopefully forever. And they're not blocking out huge areas. But they're really, really important to the community. The community wants to see those areas managed. They want those embedded in future land use plans. Okay. High conservation zones are primarily our connectivity of the land base. The connections on the land are critical as well. We can't just have all these little islands of, okay, here's an important spiritual site, but there's no way to get there except drive down the highway, and it takes away from the entire experience and the ability of community members to live the life that they're trying to live and have embedded in their treaty. So there's a lot of high conservation connections zone, and it's not just for connecting spiritual sites. A lot of it is historical trails. They're wildlife corridors, making sure that hunting grounds are not, we don't just have 30,000 hectares of hunting grounds here, but those hunting grounds are going to stay healthy because we're maintaining those connections with other parts of the land, so you can have moose travel in the same corridors that they historically do, and you have genetic exchange and all that fun stuff that maintains a functional land base. And then there's modern conservation, still important, of course. We just want to see slightly different management regimes around it, protecting some of our creeks better, restricting some access to certain areas because some areas are just overutilized by non-First Nations in the area. So, and then general use zones as well. What those zones do, again, we are working at halfway to having these zones embedded in legislation, regulation, policy. Anybody who listens to us can help us get this embedded in the planning process so that it becomes a foundation for helping us manage the land base better. How intense we manage land base. Which parts of the land do we have to avoid? We have to avoid now versus avoiding 20 years. We can go into this area, but we're going to have to leave it alone from year 20 to year 50 in order to get that value back on the land while we're working on a different part of the land. Okay, we recognize that, and we use our management zones to help direct spatially where on the land base we can make some management changes. We're really using it right now for our restoration efforts. A lot of the historical hunting grounds and travel corridors have just been blasted in the last 20 years without a plan for restoration. So when we're talking with industry and when we're talking to the province about areas that we want to see restored sooner rather than later, these maps help us prioritize that. Okay? We go to our preservation zone, there might be 40,000 hectares of preservation zone, and there's 75 well pads that are dormant and haven't been reclaimed. They haven't even been remediated yet. So it helps us identify, working with our industry partners, say these are the areas we want you to go in first. And we know, yeah, that's a long way away from where you're working right now, but these are our highest priority. And it helps maintain that relationship. And many of the companies are working closely with us in doing that, which is very positive this year. I already mentioned access management. And again, the whole RSEA process is looking at how much disturbance can we do in certain areas and still maintain the values on the land. And our management zones are one of those foundation layers to how much can we disturb a high conservation zone and still maintain the value the community has already identified and mapped and wants to see maintained over time.
So RSEA has a lot of, don't know what our next slide is. Next steps. But it builds upon that last line there. RSEA has a lot of work it needs to do in the year 2020 so that our recommendations report in the fall can actually outline the different, we all can talk about there's a zonation on the land base right now. You can see from the work that we're doing, there's going to be a new zonation of the land base in the future. And that future is this year. So we have a lot of work to sort of wrap all this stuff up into some sort of recommendations report so that we understand what the current condition reports are saying now and what it's going to be in the future. So we've got to bring this together into something that we can hand off and people can use as part of the ongoing work that they need to have happen. We also, continue to engage our LNG and forestry partners. They're involved in our methods pilot. They're involved in the RSEA process themselves. And then we have to actually talk to the larger public as well. And we do have in Fort St. John an LRMP process that's being done, and it's jointly being developed together to go forward. So we have a good place to hand off a lot of our recommendations into that process and for them to bring the entire community up to speed with where we want things to go. So, I think one of the keys in the world of RSEA that we like to talk about is you know, RSEA started as a government-to-government process. But what we've done is, I think we've improved the relationship, and Dan and I have used this words a few times. It's now government with government. So government to, you know, you can say government to government is great, but it has some certain connotations. We are practicing what we think, and from my perspective, you know, the UNDRIP, the new legislation and all that stuff is trying to do, and it's government working with government to actually come up with what the management of the land base should look like.
Well, the carbon, yesterday we were talking about carbon sequestration, and Chris Bataille was talking about restoring he used the term wildness to the land as a way to sequester carbon and suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. We're going to be talking about it this afternoon with Blue Source, Jamie McKinnon, and Nature Bank, Phil Collin. It'd be interesting to know what the carbon implications of your zones would be if they were actually established. What would be the carbon impact?
So I haven't been to any of these meetings with you guys, so if I'm saying something wrong, just let me know. But there's 2 carbon plays usually that we look at as a nation when we're talking about carbon plays, and that one is the afforestation of areas that, if we go status quo, they're not going to be reforested. So we call it afforestation, right? Those qualify, as far as we can tell, for carbon credits, right? The second is alternative management scenarios, right? Where if you go status quo, you're going to harvest 20,000 of this 50,000 hectares. But if you go with a First Nation management scenario where we're only doing 10,000, and that gets protected through legislation or whatever is required for your carbon credits, then that carbon associated with that 10,000 hectares would also qualify as a carbon capture scenario. Because we've looked at it as potential source of funding for some of our projects as well. So those are the 2 that we've looked at, but I'm sure there's a lot of brain patterns rooms looking at a lot more than just that. Is that anywhere near what you're asking?
Yeah.
Because I think you can see, you know, like Dan's last point was different disturbance regimes on the land base, that last point, right? So we're going to have different, at the end of the day, different disturbance regimes on the land base, which will then, in the big scheme of things, have more older trees on the land base, which enhances our ability to be a carbon sink out of the Northeast. Because we already have the recreational opportunity one, that's just about roaded, but you can really see where you've got a lot of old and wilderness and, you know, you guys were talking about wild areas. Well, I got a map that can show you where we've got some really wild areas right now. But we want to increase in those red and brown areas, we want to increase the, I don't know, like we're using 2 different terms here, but we want to make some of them green as well, so that there's going to be more trees on the land base that get older.
Can I just clarify one question? I know we're in a short time. I want to make sure I understood. 80% of the infrastructure required for the FNCI scenario is in play now, insofar as the disturbance. And
Yes, not the infrastructure, but the disturbance.
Disturbance, okay.
Surface disturbance. That's, I mean, give or take 5%.
So the restoration is critically important as part of the FNCI scenario for sure. And so that I wanted to make sure I had that number right and the principle about the restoration. And then I think about from the economic values perspective, we're losing our access to the United States for natural gas. So the FNCI scenario is really important so we can access Asian markets. So we can leverage that disturbance that's there. Otherwise, it's for what point? Is that?
Leverage the disturbance, that's an interesting.
Well, it's there. It's there.
No,
We did
I like
it.
it.
We did it. We need to restore it, but we did it. And we're losing the American market fast. So the FNCI scenario with restoration, there's economic value and other values as well.
So, you know, it's an interesting, Alex, if I understand what's being at there is our domestic, we're analyzing our domestic market at 5.3 billion cubic feet per day forever, for the next 84 years on that map. What I'm hearing is that 5.3 is going to go down. So if somebody gave us a number that says 5.3 goes to 4.3 in 30 years and 2 point, whatever, it actually allows more of the existing gas. We talked about going from 9 to 18. Well, technically it's not. It's 9 to 18, but then maybe it goes to 16, 20 years from now because the 5.3 of the North American market goes to 3.3, right? And so if we had some ideas of that, if we had ideas about the North American market, the 5.3, that would be how we could model that.